Hi, students. I wanted to take a little moment here to go through each of the characteristics of culture. The first one that I'm going to go through is the first one, which is culture is shared. Um, Culture is shared refers to the idea that what we know about culture in our particular society and what other people know in their particular society is shared. We learn it. That's one of the characteristics. Culture is learned, but it's also shared. What that means is that culture is, like it says here, a constellation of shared meanings. So a constellation, a group, a large grouping of shared meanings that we have all together in our society, and those meanings reflect us, reflect who we are, but also help us interpret the world, and it keeps on being reinforced by us. So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg. What comes first? It all comes together. Without those shared meanings, we cannot make sense of our world. So the whole point, like it says over here, down here, is that meaning is both produced and interpreted by us in our interaction with one another. Culture, when we talk about culture can be both the meaning and the way that we create this meaning, the practices that we have that make us create this meaning. Um, um, an important part of having shared meanings like this, to having a culture that is shared, is that we all develop a cultural model. Every society has a cultural model. And a cultural model are those shared assumptions that we have about the world, about what we think the ideal way of living, the ideal lifestyle, the ideal meaning of life is. So it's basically within a society an agreement that we all have about what the basic parameters of living should be. If you think about it, that varies enormously cross culturally. And it can vary within a culture. Like for us, for the Americans, we are now kind of like in the middle of a major, you'll see this concept appear in this chapter too, what is called a culture war. There are groups of people in our society that really believe in a cultural model, others that believe in a slightly different cultural model, and we're very divided right now. And that happens in every society every so often. Um, in the end, though, what it means is that our cultural model, which used to be very unifying and that we share to a large extent, has become smaller. And so new ideas within this cultural model are popping up. And these new ideas are kind of pushing old ideas in the cultural model. But still, we do still have shared assumptions as Americans. We do believe a lot in money. We do believe a lot in independence. So I'll have you talk about that in a moment, um, or think about that. Another thing that we have to have, in order for culture to be shared, is that we have to have norms that we all agree that are to be shared and to be followed, right? So norms are sets of expectations and attitudes that people have about appropriate behavior. What is okay how is it okay to behave, and how is it not? Uh, Deviance, for instance, is the opposite. Is like the idea of there's expected and appropriate behavior that occurs in every community, and deviance is a way of not behaving according to that expected and appropriate behavior. And most societies have some form of deviance, and deviance, there's kinds of deviance that are tolerated and others are not. For instance, our society tends to be very violent. We live in a society where violence is an idea. It gives meaning to our society in a way. But some types of violence are more tolerated in our society than others. Um, so I'll have you in a minute think about this concept. What is deviant behavior in our society and what isn't? Um, Finally, subculture is another important concept within the idea of culture is shared. A subculture is basically a group of individuals within our larger society that think that their own way of life is different in some significant way from the, from the lifestyle of the mainstream society, of the larger groups of society. Um, Others outside the group, so mainstream society also looks upon this smaller group of people as different, as something that exists within a society, but it's a little bit different. And in American society, a classic example of that are ethnic groups. If you are of a particular ethnic heritage, for me, I'm Puerto Rican, but then we are grouped as Latinos. What that means is that I have a Spanish name. I have Spanish heritage. I speak Spanish as a linguistic group. I belong to that linguistic group of people who either speak Spanish or whose ancestors spoke Spanish. And Spanish as a language is important to us. Yeah. Secondly, for me in particular, I'm Puerto Rican, so I'm from the Caribbean. Other people are Mexican, but we form like our own little subcultures where we have our own food that we eat, our own events that we celebrate. So that is an example of a subculture. And I exist in society, in American society, extremely well. I speak English. I can understand the larger cultural model of the United States, so I share that culture too. But I also live in a smaller subculture where my family, friends that I have, or other groups, I seek out people who are like me because we share these ideals of our own subculture. Okay. So I'd like to have you do a small, I call it here a group exercise, but you can do it individually as well. The idea of think about cultural models, and in terms of culture is shared. If we live in a society that shares culture, what is our cultural model? What are those ideological agreements that we have that give meaning to our culture and that allow us to interpret the behaviors of other individuals around us and understand it, even if we reject it. We reject it because somehow to us is deviant within the larger cultural model. Yeah. And then in that, what is really deviant behavior in our society? What do you consider deviant behavior in our society? What ideas could you have about that? And then also think, what was deviant 20 years ago that is not deviant anymore nowadays? I'm sure you can think of many things. If you think about your grandparents and what they think is inappropriate, and that doesn't conform to societal norms, yeah, and that you think is, I think every generation has that. Like we look at our grandparents, and they are, for me, my grandparents had like a very idea of what it was like, what it was important to be ladylike, what it meant to be that. And I grew up in an era where we were rebelling against that. We were saying that's not what it means to be a woman. That's your old school thinking. Yeah. So that idea is really a consideration of how within a group you can have deviant behavior that exists right now, and that the group tolerates or not. And then you can have a previous generation that had an idea of what deviant behavior was back then, and it's changed nowadays, that idea. So think about this, and we'll come back to our next characteristic of culture.